In the fading light of a Texas autumn 1881, the last livestock auction of the season was winding down in the dusty little town of Elmsford Junction. Among the grit and noise stood Jedediah McGraw, a rancher known more for keeping to himself than trading words. He'd come for a horse, nothing more. But fate had a quiet way of changing plans. Near the last corral stood a girl barefoot, no older than 19, a frayed dress clinging to her frame. A rope meant for an animal was tied to her wrist. Her father, half drunk and loud, shouted to the lingering crowd that she was deaf, dumb, and obedient. Said she wasn't worth dragging home. Jed didn't speak. He only looked, not at the man, but at the girl. She didn't cry, didn't plead, just met his eyes with a calm that felt ancient. And in that stillness, he recognized himself not in her silence, but in her understanding of it. Without fully knowing why, he offered coin enough for the horse, and more than the man deserved for the girl. She didn't speak, only followed Jed back to his wagon. No protest, no sound, just the soft scrape of her feet in the dust. The ride back to his ranch was silent. 3 miles of wind and pines, and nothing but the crunch of wagon wheels. Jed wasn't sure if she'd bolt once they arrived. But when he opened the gate, she stepped down without fear, her eyes scanning the prairie like it was the first place that hadn't tried to erase her. Inside the cabin, he lit the stove, pushed a piece of chalk toward her, and pointed at the door frame. She knelt and wrote in careful strokes, "Emmeline." He read it aloud, once, then again. She didn't smile, just turned and walked into the barn as if she belonged. And in that silence, something began. Not trust, not love, not yet, but something that had the shape of both. Later, when she tugged his sleeve before lightning struck the tree behind the shed, seconds before it split the earth, he understood she didn't hear the world like others. She felt it, listened not with ears, but with instinct. From that moment on, Jed didn't just see her, he noticed her. And nothing, not even the wind across Briar Ridge, would sound quite the same again. The first morning came quiet and gold-washed. Jedediah McGraw rose before the sun crested Briar Ridge as he always did. But this time he wasn't alone. The girl Emmeline she had written was already outside barefoot, crouched near the fence, watching the cattle move through the mist like ghosts. Jed paused at the door, coffee in hand, studying her. She hadn't asked for anything, hadn't spoken a word, but something about the way she moved, measured presence, settled the edges of his nerves. By mid-morning, she'd found the feed sacks without being shown, boiled water without a word. When he pointed toward the tack room, she nodded once and went. She moved like she'd always belonged, near firewood and animal breath. Not like a guest, not like a prisoner, but like someone who knew how to be useful without being seen. He left a piece of chalk for her that evening, tapping the pantry door frame with his knuckle. "Anything you need," he said, not expecting a reply. When he returned after evening chores, one word was written in slanted letters: "Wind." He looked out. The stars were gone. The air had thickened. By nightfall, the wind was up. Not howling yet, but restless. Jed checked the barn, his instincts kicking in. But it was Emmeline who came to him, breathless hands moving fast. She couldn't speak, but she didn't have to. She tugged his coat, pointed east, then back toward the ridge. He hesitated, still inside the calf shed. A sick one lay tucked in straw, trembling. But something in her gaze, urgent, clear, moved him. He stepped outside just in time to see the lightning cleave the tree behind them in half. The thunder hit like a cannon. The blast knocked dust from the rafters. Embers sparked in the sky. Jed staggered. Emmeline didn't. She stood still, lit by firelight, her breath short but steady. Not shocked, prepared. After the storm passed and the animals were calm, Jed sat at the kitchen table staring at his hands. Emmeline came in, poured water, placed it in front of him. No words, just the sound of the wind settling against the shutters. He looked up at her, jaw tight. "How'd you know?" he asked. She didn't answer, just moved toward the window, laid her palm flat against the pane and closed her eyes. It wasn't magic. He saw that now. It was something older, sharper, a way of listening that had nothing to do with sound. The next day, she stood with the old mare, her fingers brushing the sore leg in slow, thoughtful circles. The mare didn't flinch, just breathed through it. That evening, Jed left another note on the doorframe. Not a question this time, just a word. "Thank you." He wasn't sure if she'd reply. But the next morning, written underneath in soft strokes, were two more. "I know." That was how it began. Not with conversation, but with noticing. With watching her run fingers over saddle leather like reading a book. With seeing her pause when the wind changed direction, or when the dog whined low and long before dawn. She said nothing, but she listened to everything. And Jed, for the first time in years, found himself listening back. Not for words, but for meaning. And slowly, without either of them trying, the silence turned from something hollow into something whole. Jed didn't sleep that night. The wind had calmed, but something inside him hadn't. He sat by the hearth boots still on the fire, low and stubborn. Across from him, Emmeline rested in the rocker, her hands folded in her lap, eyes half closed. She hadn't said a word since the lightning, but she didn't need to. That silence, it wasn't absence, it was presence. By dawn, Jed rose and stepped outside. Frost clung to the rails. A hawk wheeled over the ridge. He lit a pipe with shaking fingers and tried not to think of his father's grave beneath the old oak. But ghosts didn't stay buried long out here. At town that afternoon, the sheriff, Boone Harlan, caught up to him outside the feed store. Boone had known Jed since boyhood, back when the McGraw name still stirred pride, not questions. "You hear the land office is stirring again," Boone said, voice low. Jed nodded once. "Talk as your father might have taken more than he was due. Folks whispering old relocation deeds, maybe blood mixed with ink." Jed said nothing. He didn't have to. Boone looked at him hard. "I'm not saying it's your fault," he added, "but reckon you should prepare." That night, Jed sat on the porch, arms heavy with history. He hadn't told Emmeline. Not yet. Not because she wouldn't understand, but because she would. As if summoned, she stepped outside, barefoot, blanket around her shoulders. She didn't speak, just sat beside him. After a moment, she reached out and placed her hand not on his arm, not on his back, but right over his heart. Jed swallowed hard. "She always said we owed this land," he muttered, surprising himself with the sound of his own voice. "But Pa, he said it owed us." Emmeline looked at him, eyes dark as wet earth. Then slowly she stood and walked across the yard to the oak tree. The wind shifted. Leaves stirred. She didn't need to read the stone to know who lay beneath, and somehow Jed knew she understood. Not the facts, the ache. Later that week, when a sick cow wandered off from the herd, Jed barely noticed, his mind clouded by guilt. But Emmeline moved without pause. She took straw to the birthing stall, added mint leaves to the drinking trough, and stood beside the animal until it lay down gently and gave birth by nightfall. He asked her later how she'd known. She didn't sign, didn't write. She just opened the barn door wider, as if to say, "I pay attention." It unsettled him, not because it was unnatural, but because it felt too natural. Like she heard the ground breathe. He watched her more after that, how she always paused at the door before stepping out, like testing the air. How she touched a saddle before using it, as if asking permission. How she always knew when he needed a second cup of coffee, though he never said so. It was like being known in a way words could never offer. And for a man raised on silence, raised by a father who spoke only in orders, Jed found that terrifying and beautiful. He'd started to understand then. Emmeline didn't need to speak. She wasn't silent because she lacked voice. She was silent because she listened to things most people had forgotten how to hear. And maybe, just maybe, she'd been sent not to haunt him, but to teach him. The whispers began at the blacksmith's porch. "She don't talk, but she sure watches," the wife muttered, folding breadcloths with hands tight as wire. "Looks at cattle like she knows which one'll fall next." By week's end, the preacher's boy added more wood to the fire. "She touched our goat," he said, wide-eyed, "and it birthed early, too early. That ain't right." No one had ever heard Emmeline speak, and the fewer words she gave, the more the town seemed eager to fill in the blanks with fear. At the general store, a woman pulled her daughter close when Emmeline passed by, even though the girl only came for flour. Outside the post, someone spat near her feet. Most days, she kept her head-down basket tucked firm in her arms. She never flinched, but Jed could see it, the way her fingers curled tighter, the way her steps grew smaller, like she was trying to disappear from land that refused to forget. Jed said nothing, and she never asked. But silence out here could be as sharp as a gun. Then came the boy. A ranch hand's son, no more than 10, was struck by sudden fever. Red-faced, near seizing. No doctor in town, he was out east visiting kin. The family panicked, and in the dark of the barn it was Emmeline who stepped forward. She didn't ask. She didn't wait. She knelt beside the child, laid a hand on his chest, another on his forehead, and closed her eyes. Then she rose, walked outside, and picked 3 herbs from Jed's drying wall: lavender, fever, few, rabbit tobacco. She steeped them into a warm cloth, pressed it to the boy's neck, and stayed by his side through the night. By sunrise, the child sat up asking for bread. His mother wept. And still the next day, at the well, she was heard whispering. How did she know? The fear had shifted, no longer quiet. 3 days later, they came with torches not lit, but carried like promises. 8 of them, dust thick on boots, determination in every step. Jed met them in the barn doorway, arms folded. Boone Harlan was there too, not as lawman, but as man standing off to the side watching. McGraw said, "Mr. Withers, the old cattleman, we want her gone." Jed said nothing. "She hears things she ought not. That girl ain't natural. She's mute," Jed answered, voice low. "That ain't deaf," Withers snapped. "She sees before the sky changes. Talks to animals. My steer died last week. She was the only one touched it." "What does that tell you?" "She listens," Jed said. "Too well," someone muttered. Inside the cabin, Emmeline stood behind the curtain. She'd heard the gravel shift, seen the faces, not hateful, but worse. Certain. She moved to the door, but Jed raised a hand, then stepped forward, slow boots sinking into thawing mud. She saved a child. Or maybe she gave him the fever, someone spat. Jed's voice never rose. "She's the only person I know who hears without ears, who listens with her hands, her breath, her soul." Boone shifted, said nothing, but his eyes narrowed, not in judgment, but thought. Jed looked out across the crowd. "If you want to run off someone for being different, for seeing the world you're too scared to face, you'll have to go through me." No one moved. Then slowly, one by one, they left, torches unlit. That night, the wind returned. But for the first time, it didn't sound like threat. It sounded like protection. And beside the fire, Emmeline poured cider into 2 mugs. She said nothing. She didn't have to. Winter came slow that year, as if the land was unsure whether to freeze or forgive. The first snow dusted the prairie, like someone laying down a soft apology, and Emmeline moved through it with quiet certainty. She wrapped wool around the chicken coop, dried roots near the hearth, and stitched patches into Jed's old coat with thread pulled from her own sleeves. Jed watched her sometimes from the barn door. She didn't just mend things. She repaired what others forgot was broken. They spoke less with words and more with habit. Every morning she brewed coffee before dawn, left it warming near the fire. Every evening she would sit by the window, needle in hand, sewing not for herself, but for others mittens for the widow, next ridge, over a scarf for Tom Weaver's boy, whose ears always turned red by October. Word spread slow like molasses in frost, but it spread. The first to come was Tom, hat in hand, shoulder drooping like a sagging fence post. "Doc's out east," he mumbled at Jed's porch. "Heard she fixes things." Quiet. Jed didn't answer, just stepped aside. Emmeline didn't flinch when she saw him. Just led him inside, examined the torn shoulder with a gaze sharper than most knives, and moved her hands like she was listening to the wound itself. She wrapped it in a blend of herbs and linen. He didn't ask questions, just left 2 days later with his arm strong enough to hitch a mule. Then came the widow, shaking from sleepless nights. Emmeline sat beside her at dusk, fingers lightly pressed to her back. She never said what the woman wept for, only held her through it. The next morning the widow returned with a pie and a hand-knit scarf. For the girl, she said, the one who hears more than most of us do. Even Boone Harlan returned. He didn't come in uniform, just boots muddied from creek crossings and shoulders slumped with years of watching law twist slower than justice. He stood on the porch watching Emmeline walk barefoot in the snow, laying cedar shavings along the horse stalls. "She scares folks," he said without malice. Jed didn't look at him. "So does honesty." Boone huffed. "You ever wonder if she sees things we forgot how to feel?" Jed nodded once. "Every day." Boone didn't stay long, but before he left, he touched his brim toward Emmeline. She nodded back. That was all. By the second thaw, the school children began visiting, not because they were told to, but because their feet carried them there, drawn by stories whispered at supper tables. They came quiet, curious. And Emmeline welcomed them like wind welcomes wheat. No commands, only space. She taught them how to listen, not with ears, but with skin, eyes, breath. How to tell when a rabbit was afraid versus shy. How to know which clouds meant rain and which ones only looked like it. She never used a chalkboard. She used stillness. And when one boy asked why she never spoke, she smiled just once and placed her hand over his chest. "Because I hear this," she signed, slow and certain. Jed built a bench beneath the cottonwood that spring. Most evenings they sat there, him with his coffee, her with a book she couldn't read but liked the smell of. He reached for her hand one night. "You make this place full," he signed in halting letters. She didn't sign back. She just leaned her head to his shoulder. And for the first time since the war, Jed McGraw let himself believe in something bigger than silence. The storm didn't come with warning. No scent of ash on the wind. No flicker across the ridge. Just a stillness sharp and unnatural that settled over the prairie like a held breath. Jedediah McGraw sat on the porch watching the horizon bruise purple beneath the setting sun. Thunder rolled low and steady like a drum from deep in the earth. He knew that sound, had heard it in war, in cattle stampedes, in dreams he never spoke of. Inside, Emmeline was setting the table when the haze reached the cabin. At first, it was faint, a scent like dry cedar splitting, but it grew fast. Smoke, bitter, alive. Jed burst through the door, eyes wide. "Fires near Briar Ridge," he said, already soaking blankets in the wash basin. "Wind's pushing it this way." She didn't speak, just nodded, calm, but alert, gathering jars and cloth in a satchel. But when she bent for her shawl, her body stiffened. Her hand went to her belly. Jed caught her just as her knees buckled. "It's time," she whispered, breathless. He didn't panic, not outwardly, but his arms shook as he lifted her, the firelight outside growing brighter, closer. Wrapped in soaked cloth, they fled into the wind, the smoke curling around them like a curse. The old stone hut sat built into the hillside, half forgotten and cool even in summer heat. Jed knew it from years past, once used for birthing calves and mending bones. It would have to do. He kicked the door open with his boot and laid her down on the old straw bed. Flames cracked in the distance, their light flickering through the thick walls like memories trying to break in. She screamed once, raw and fierce. Jed knelt beside her, pressing cool cloth to her brow. "You're not alone," he said, voice thick. "You hear me, Emmeline? Not alone." Her hand found his, clenched tight. Hours passed in the hush between contractions. Fire roared somewhere beyond the stone. But inside, another battle was being fought. One not of heat or smoke, but breath and will. And then at last a cry, tiny, piercing, alive. Jed held the child red and trembling, then placed her gently into Emmeline's arms. She wept silently, shoulders shaking. And when she looked up, her eyes were shining. "Rose," she whispered. "She's Rose." The name filled the space like sunrise. But as joy bloomed, Jed wavered. He sank against the wall, face pale, chest rising uneven. Emmeline's smile faded. "Jed," she called. He didn't answer. She moved to him, baby in one arm, the other hand searching for his pulse. "Don't leave," she pleaded. Her forehead pressed to his shoulder. "Not now." The child cried a full, determined sound, and Jed gasped a breath like breaking water. His eyes fluttered open. "She's loud," he rasped. "You are too," Emmeline whispered, holding both their lives in her lap. Outside, the fire had moved on its fury, leaving behind scorched earth and silence. But in that stone room, a new sound echoed, small, defiant, full of promise. A child's cry, and in it something had returned. Not just life, but hope. Dawn broke slow through the cracks in the stone hut, spilling golden light across ash-streaked walls. The fire had moved on, leaving only silence and smoke trails drifting toward the horizon. But inside, life had taken root. Emmeline cradled the baby close, her fingers wrapped gently around the tiny wrist. Rose stirred, let out a yawn, then nestled back into the crook of her arm. Her skin was still warm from the miracle of birth. Jed didn't move. He lay slumped against the far wall, his chest barely rising. His lips were pale, his fingers slack. At first, Emmeline thought he was asleep, exhausted from hours of fear and labor. But when she called his name, nothing answered. Not a twitch, not a breath, not a... She pressed her ear to his chest. Faint, so faint. "No," she whispered, voice cracking. "Not now. Not after everything." The baby whimpered, then cried sharp, insistent. A sound that didn't beg but demanded. Jed gasped, just once. But it was enough. His lungs caught fire with air. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused, then found hers. "She's got lungs," he murmured. Emmeline laughed, half sob, half joy. "So do you," she said, brushing soot from his forehead. "So do you." She wrapped them both in the last dry blanket, the child between them. For hours they lay like that, not speaking, just breathing together. When Jed finally sat up, he reached for her hand. "You saved me," he said softly. She shook her head. "No," he added, "not from the fire. From before, from myself." Later, as they stepped out into the morning, the land looked wounded. Trees stood blackened. Grass was scorched down to the roots. But something in the air had changed. A stillness, not of death, but of waiting. Back at the ranch, the well still held water. The chickens had survived. Even the fence near the east pasture, long broken, now stood untouched by flame. Jed sat on the porch, Rose in his arms. She gripped his finger like it was the only thing in the world that made sense. Emmeline watched them from the garden, her dress stained with smoke, her hair loose in the wind. She moved to the side of the house where the roses used to grow. Soil there was dark, still warm. She knelt and turned it gently with her fingers. Beneath the top layer, roots, charred, yes, but not dead. Behind her, Jed spoke. "You're trying again." Emmeline looked up, nodding. Jed stepped closer. They never bloomed, he said. Not once. They will, she signed. This time they will. That night, Emmeline wrote a single sentence on the slate board beside the cabin door. Some things must be lost to make room for miracles. And in the days that followed, the world softened. Smoke lifted. Neighbors returned not with questions, but with pies, with baby clothes, with quiet apologies folded into homemade bread. They didn't ask what happened that night, but they saw the roses bloom come spring, not all at once, not perfectly, but enough. Years passed quiet and slow, the way grass pushes through ash when no one's watching. The land healed first. Then the people, the house that once stood in silence, now hummed with the rhythm of footsteps, laughter, and the occasional soft babble of a child. Rose, with her wild curls and steady gaze, learned to walk along the porch rails Jed built by hand. She tottered through the garden. Emmeline tended hands, always brushing petals like she was saying hello. Some called her clever. Others whispered she'd inherited her mother's knowing silence. Jed just called her light. The ranch didn't change fast, but it changed. Tom Weaver came often, bringing tools or broken hinges to mend. The widow who once cried in Emmeline's arms now brought preserves and taught Rose to sew. And the children, they came in groups now, not by command, but by some pull of wind and wordless wonder. They sat at Emmeline's feet beneath the cottonwood tree, eyes wide, hearts open. She taught them without speaking, only gestures, presence. She taught them how to read a horse's flinch, how to feel when rain was coming, how to know when someone was sad, even if they smiled. One boy asked her once, "How do you know all this?" She placed her palm gently on his chest. "Because I listen," she signed. Not long after someone carved those words into the side of the old barn, "Listen with more than your ears." And that was when folks truly stopped calling her strange. Even Sheriff Boone Harlan, now slowed by age, came often to sit on the porch. He never said much, just sipped cider and watched the way Jed reached for Emmeline's hand without needing a reason. "She changed you," Boone said one evening. Jed smiled. "No," he said. "She reminded me I was worth changing." Some nights, Jed brought out the old harmonica. He'd sit under the cottonwood play tunes with no name, and Emmeline would close her eyes, swaying like she felt each note in her bones. One evening, as dusk folded over the valley and the wheat fields whispered low, Emmeline turned to him. Her voice, rare and soft, broke the air like snow landing on water. "I do not need sound," she whispered. "Only you." Jed blinked, lips parted, throat tight. "I hear you," he answered. "Always have." They sat like that long after the sun dipped behind the hills. No words, just warmth, just presence. The next morning, Rose stood by the door, small fingers tracing letters across the wooden slate her mother had written on for years. It read, "Today will be kind. I feel it." And somehow everyone believed her. When strangers passed through town and asked about the girl who once could not speak, no one mentioned curses or silence anymore. They said, "She listens. And when she listens, the world listens back." One winter, a boy got lost during a snowstorm. Emmeline knelt in the snow, face tilted to the wind, then pointed west. They followed without question and found the child alive. After that, they never doubted her again. The final scene was not loud. It was a late spring morning. Emmeline and Jed walked together along the ridge. Rose ran ahead, chasing butterflies. The sky above was wide and gold-touched, the fields green with forgiveness. They reached the old plot where the roses once refused to bloom. Now they did. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough. And sometimes enough is the start of forever. Some stories aren't meant to be shouted. They're meant to be heard in silence. The tale of Jedediah McGraw and Emmeline reminds us that listening isn't just about sound, and connection isn't born from noise. It grows instead in the spaces between words, in shared coffee at dawn, a hand resting on a shoulder, a garden planted not for beauty, but for hope. For those of us who have lived long enough to know loss, and longer still to know how love can return when we least expect it, this story offers more than nostalgia. It offers memory. And in memory, we find healing. Emily never spoke yet. She heard the world clearer than most. Jed never expected to be heard yet. She understood him without asking. And in that unlikely bond between a man hardened by silence and a woman fluent in it, we see something rare grace born not from perfection, but from presence. Maybe that's the message we all need to remember. That we are not too old to begin again. That love doesn't always arrive with trumpets. It sometimes enters quietly barefoot, carrying only a blanket and an open heart. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of someone who once listened when others only talked, then you're already part of what we're building here. Click the screen to stay with us for the next tale, a little more worn by time, a little softer, and perhaps a little closer to your own. And if you believe stories like this still matter, tap the like button. Subscribe to join a corner of the West, where words are few, but meaning runs deep. Because some stories don't end. They echo. And maybe, just maybe, they grow where no one expected anything to bloom.